The air in courtroom 3B was thick with the stale scent of old paper and quiet desperation. At the center of it all sat 17-year-old Jamal, a lanky black teen with eyes that held a storm of fear and defiance. He stood alone, a solitary figure against the monolithic institution of justice, unable to afford a lawyer. Across from him, perched high on his judicial throne, was Judge Thompson, a man whose silver hair and starched robes couldn't hide the glacial contempt in his gaze. "No lawyer, Mr. Hayes," the judge drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "Feeling lucky today?" The courtroom snickered. Jamal simply straightened his shoulders, his voice clear and steady. "I'm just here to tell the truth, Your Honor." The judge's smirk widened. He was about to make an example of this kid. He had no idea that in 5 minutes, his own world would be the one to shatter. Jamal Hayes had never been in a courtroom before, but he knew how to read a room. And this room, with its polished mahogany, towering ceilings, and rows of impassive faces, was designed to make him feel small. It was working. The vast space seemed to swallow sound, amplifying the frantic thumping of his own heart into a drumbeat of doom. He clutched a worn manila folder, the only armor he had. Inside were his notes, his life, the flimsy proof of his innocence, written in his own neat architectural script. He wasn't a troublemaker. His world was built on straight lines and clear plans. It revolved around 2 unshakable pillars: his 10-year-old sister, Maya, and his dream of becoming an architect. His nights were spent at their small kitchen table, sketching fantastical buildings that reached for the sky, structures of glass and steel that defied gravity. They were a stark contrast to the cramped 2-bedroom apartment he shared with his family in the city's forgotten West Side, a place where dreams were often suffocated by the grim reality of survival. His father, a construction worker with calloused hands and a quiet strength, had been the one to plant that dream in him. He'd taught Jamal that you could build a future with your own 2 hands, that integrity was the bedrock of any strong structure, be it a skyscraper or a man's character. He'd died on a job site 2 years ago, a faulty scaffold, a fall, a tragedy that had ripped the soul out of their family and plunged them into a financial struggle that felt like drowning in slow motion. His mother, a woman who carried the weight of their world on her slender shoulders, worked double shifts as a nurse, her exhaustion a constant silent presence in their home. Jamal had stepped up, becoming a surrogate parent to Maya, a bright, bubbly girl whose laughter was the soundtrack of their lives. But Maya had a rare respiratory condition that required a cocktail of expensive medications. That's where the trouble started. The pharmacy had called, her prescription was ready, but their insurance, a casualty of their precarious finances, had lapsed. The cost was $800, a figure so impossibly large it might as well have been $1 million. Desperation was a cold, sharp thing that lodged itself in his throat. Jamal sold his most prized possession, a vintage 35mm camera his father had given him, the one he'd used to learn about light and shadow and form. It only fetched $200. He'd picked up extra shifts washing dishes at a local diner, the smell of grease clinging to him long after he clocked out, his hands raw. He was still short. That night, walking home under the sickly orange glow of the streetlights, defeated, he'd seen it, a bloated leather wallet lying on the sidewalk. He'd opened it, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Inside was a driver's license, a few credit cards, and a thick wedge of cash, $20 bills, 50 of them, $1,000. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees had washed over him. This was the answer. A miracle, a gift from a universe that had taken so much. But then he saw the photo on the license, a smiling, middle-aged man with a kind face, flanked by a woman and 2 kids. A family. A man who probably had his own struggles. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a low, steady rumble from a sun-drenched afternoon spent fixing the porch steps. A man is only as good as his word, son. You build your life on a foundation of honesty. Anything else is just sand. Jamal had closed the wallet, the smell of the rich leather foreign and tempting. He walked 3 blocks to the address on the license, a neat brick house in a neighborhood with manicured lawns. He'd rung the bell, and a woman had answered, her face etched with worry. He'd handed her the wallet, explained where he found it, and turned to leave. He didn't want a reward. He just wanted to get home. But as he walked away, 2 police cars had screeched to a halt, boxing him in. The woman's husband, it turned out, was a real estate mogul who had reported the wallet stolen, claiming it contained not just cash, but a valuable diamond earring he was taking to be appraised. An earring that was now, conveniently, missing. They'd found no earring on Jamal. But in the eyes of the police, and now the court, a black kid from the West Side in possession of a rich man's wallet was an open and shut case. He was charged with felony theft. The public defender assigned to him had glanced at his file for all of 5 minutes, his eyes already on the next case, and advised him to plead guilty for a lighter sentence. Jamal had refused. Pleading guilty meant admitting to something he didn't do. It meant becoming the statistic everyone already assumed he was. It meant letting his father down. So he'd fired the public defender, determined to represent himself. Across the courtroom, Judge Arthur Thompson adjusted his robes, a gesture of practiced authority. He'd been on the bench for 30 years, and he'd seen thousands of kids like Jamal come through his courtroom. They were all the same, he believed. Products of broken homes and bad choices, looking for an easy way out. He prided himself on being a no-nonsense judge, a bulwark against the rising tide of crime he saw eroding his city. But beneath the judicial armor was a man hollowed out by his own private grief. 20 years ago, his wife, Catherine, and their 14-year-old daughter, Emily, had been killed by a drunk driver. The driver was a 17-year-old from the West Side, high on stolen liquor, joyriding in a stolen car. From that day forward, Thompson's world had fractured into a simple, brutal binary. Us and them. The law-abiding and the lawless. Every young man who stood before him, especially a young black man from the wrong side of town, was a ghost of the boy who had destroyed his life. His grief had curdled into a quiet, simmering rage, a prejudice he would have denied to his dying breath, but one that shaped every ruling he made. He looked down at Jamal, a boy playing at being a man, and felt a familiar wave of irritation. This was a waste of his time, a waste of taxpayer money. He would make it quick. He would teach this boy a lesson about consequences. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the microphone, a gavel of sound that silenced the room. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "the court sees you have chosen to represent yourself, a bold strategy. Let's see how it plays out for you." The first hour was a masterclass in humiliation. The prosecutor, a sharp-suited man named Henderson, with a predatory smile and the confidence of a man who rarely lost, painted a picture of Jamal as a calculated opportunist. He called the real estate mogul, Mr. Davenport, to the stand. Davenport, a man whose tailored suit probably cost more than Jamal's family earned in a month, recounted his version of events with polished, rehearsed ease. He spoke of his momentary lapse in leaving the wallet on his car roof as he loaded groceries, the panic he felt upon realizing his mistake, and the irreplaceable sentimental value of the diamond earring, a family heirloom. "And this young man," Henderson said, gesturing dramatically towards Jamal, "just happened to be there, to find a wallet containing not just over $1,000 in cash, but a priceless gem?" "It seems unlikely," Davenport said, shaking his head with faux sadness. When it was Jamal's turn to cross-examine, he felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, dissecting his every move. He took a deep breath, his notes trembling in his hand. "Mr. Davenport," he began, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat and started again. "Mr. Davenport, can you describe the earring for the court?" Henderson shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance?" "Sustained," Judge Thompson snapped, not even looking at Jamal. "The witness has already stated it was a valuable family heirloom. We don't need a fashion show, Mr. Hayes. Get to the point if you have one." The courtroom snickered. Jamal's face burned. He felt like a fool, his carefully prepared questions crumbling before he could even ask them. He tried a different approach. "Sir, you said you were taking the earring to be appraised. Do you have any documentation for that? A receipt from when you bought it? A previous appraisal?" Davenport shifted in his seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing his smooth features. "It was an heirloom, passed down through generations. There is no receipt. So, no proof it even exists?" Jamal pressed, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "No photograph? No insurance policy listing the item?" "Objection," Henderson yelled. "Counsel is badgering the witness and making baseless insinuations." "Mr. Hayes," Judge Thompson's voice was a low growl, "you are walking a very thin line. The witness's integrity is not on trial here. Yours is. Do you have any real questions, or are you just going to continue to cast aspersions?" "I'm just trying to establish the facts," Jamal said, his voice pleading. "The facts are you were found with Mr. Davenport's property," Thompson retorted. "Move on." Every attempt Jamal made was shot down. He tried to question the police officer who arrested him, wanting to ask why the initial police report made no mention of an earring, only cash. The officer claimed it was a clerical oversight. An addendum was made later. The judge accepted it without question. He tried to introduce a character witness, his boss from the diner, a man named Sal who was waiting outside, ready to testify to Jamal's honesty and work ethic. The judge dismissed it as irrelevant hearsay. The courtroom became a pressure cooker. The air grew hotter, thicker. Jamal felt his composure beginning to crack. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting a system that had already judged him. He looked at the jury, a panel of mostly white, middle-aged faces, their expressions ranging from boredom to suspicion. They didn't see him. They saw a caricature, a thug, the villain from a story they'd heard 1,000 times before. The prosecutor's closing argument was a symphony of veiled racism and classism. He spoke of predators who stalked the good, hard-working citizens of the city. He painted the West Side as a den of criminality from which Jamal had emerged to snatch a piece of the good life he felt entitled to. Then, it was Jamal's turn. He stood, his hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table to keep them from shaking. He looked at the judge, at the jury, at the smug faces of Henderson and Davenport. The script he had practiced in his cell for hours evaporated from his mind. All that was left was the raw, burning truth. "I don't have a fancy education," he began, his voice quiet but carrying in the suddenly silent room. "I don't have a lawyer in a $1,000 suit. I don't have a lot of things. But I have my integrity, and I'm telling you I did not steal anything." He told them about his father, about his dream of being an architect, about his little sister, Maya. He explained why he needed the money, the desperation he felt. "I saw the cash," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "And for a second, just 1 second, I thought my prayers had been answered. I thought about my sister and the medicine she needs. But then I thought about my dad. He always said, 'It takes years to build a reputation and only a minute to tear it down with one bad choice.' I couldn't do it. I couldn't take something that wasn't mine." He looked directly at Davenport. "I walked 3 blocks to your house, sir. I rang your doorbell and handed your wife your wallet because it was the right thing to do. That's it. There was no earring. You know it, and I know it. Judge Thompson watched the performance with a cynical eye. It was a good story. He'd give the kid that. He'd clearly rehearsed it. The sick sister, the dead father, the appeal to honor. It was all a bit much. A desperate last-ditch effort to manipulate the jury's emotions. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Are you quite finished with your soliloquy, Mr. Hayes?" Jamal faltered, the air knocked out of him. "Because as moving as your tale of woe is," the judge continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "it doesn't change the facts. You had the wallet. The earring is missing. It's a simple equation." He turned to the jury. "The evidence is clear. Don't be swayed by a sob story designed to distract you from the truth." The dismissal was so absolute, so contemptuous, it felt like a physical blow. Jamal sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. He had poured his heart out, had laid his soul bare, and the most powerful man in the room had laughed in his face. He had lost. The weight of it was crushing. He thought of Maya, of his mother's tired face, of the scholarship application for architecture school sitting on his desk at home, a relic from a future that would never come. He had failed them all. The conflict wasn't just in the courtroom, it was inside him, a raging battle between hope and the bitter, encroaching certainty of despair. The jury filed out, their footsteps a somber, shuffling retreat. The room, which had been a cauldron of tension, was now eerily quiet. There was only the rustling of papers and the low murmur of Henderson congratulating Davenport with a self-satisfied slap on the back. Judge Thompson was already gathering his files, eager to move on to the next case, the next cog in the machine of justice. To him, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. Another one off the streets. Jamal sat numbly, staring at the folder in front of him. It was over. He had presented his truth, and it had been rejected, mocked, and thrown back in his face. He felt a profound sense of emptiness, a hollowing out of his very core. He idly flipped through his notes, the pages a blur through the tears welling in his eyes. He stopped on the last page. It was a photograph, a cheap, slightly blurry print he'd made at a drugstore kiosk. He had almost not included it. It seemed insignificant, a loose thread in the tightly woven narrative of the prosecution. But something had made him print it out. A nagging feeling, an architect's instinct for detail, for documenting the site before the work begins. It was a photo of the sidewalk where he'd found the wallet. He had taken it with his phone the next day, not sure why, just feeling a desperate need to document everything, to hold on to some piece of objective reality in a world that had suddenly turned subjective and hostile. He looked at the photo. The cracked pavement, a stray cigarette butt, a dark, circular stain that was probably old gum. And something else. Something he hadn't noticed before. Something almost invisible unless you were looking for it. He leaned closer, his heart giving a sudden, painful lurch. "Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse. He stood up, his legs unsteady. Judge Thompson sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of impatience. "Mr. Hayes, the jury is deliberating. There is nothing more to be said. Sit down." "Please, Your Honor," Jamal insisted, his voice gaining strength. "Just one more thing. I have evidence I overlooked. It's important." Henderson laughed out loud. "Evidence? A little late for that, isn't it? The defense has rested, Your Honor. The boy is just trying to delay the inevitable." "He's right, Mr. Hayes," the judge said, his patience gone. "The time for presenting evidence is over. This is not a game." "It's not a game to me!" Jamal's voice echoed in the courtroom, raw and desperate. "This is my life. Please, just look. 5 minutes? That's all I ask." Something in his plea, its sheer, unvarnished desperation, cut through the judge's cynicism. Or perhaps it was the desire to get this over with, to shut the kid up for good. He waved a dismissive hand, an act of supreme annoyance. Fine. 5 minutes. But this had better be the most compelling piece of evidence in the history of jurisprudence, or I'll hold you in contempt. Approach the bench. Jamal walked forward, his steps feeling both heavy and light. He placed the photograph on the judge's bench. I found the wallet right here, he said, pointing to a spot on the cracked concrete. I took this photo the next day. Judge Thompson glanced at it, unimpressed. It's a picture of a sidewalk, Mr. Hayes. What am I supposed to be looking at? The artistic composition? Here, Your Honor, Jamal pointed with a trembling finger. Next to that stain. Look closely. The judge leaned in, his brow furrowed in annoyance. He squinted, and then he saw it. A tiny, metallic glint, half hidden in a crack in the pavement. It was the unmistakable shape of a small, round object. Next to it, almost lost in the grime, was the grated opening of a storm drain. It's a storm drain, the judge said flatly. So what? When I picked up the wallet, I heard something, Jamal said, the memory coming back to him in a rush, a detail his panicked mind had discarded. A little sound, like a coin falling. I didn't think anything of it. But look, that glint, it's right next to the drain. A flicker of something. Not belief, but professional curiosity, stirred in the judge. He picked up the photo, holding it under the light. He looked at Jamal, then at Henderson, whose smug smile was beginning to look a little strained. This is absurd, Henderson blustered. A blurry photo of a sidewalk? He probably planted it. This is a desperate stunt. How could I have planted it? Jamal shot back. I've been in a holding cell for 2 days. This photo was time-stamped on my phone the morning after my arrest. You can check the metadata. Judge Thompson was silent for a long moment. The machinery of the court had ground to a halt, all because of a cheap photograph and a boy who wouldn't quit. The 5 minutes he had allotted were ticking by. The easy, straightforward case was suddenly, annoyingly, complicated. He could dismiss this. He could ignore it, and let the jury decide based on the evidence they'd heard. It was the simplest path, the path of least resistance. But the image of that tiny glint, that small, overlooked detail, lodged itself in his mind. It was a loose thread, and his job, his duty, was to pull on it, no matter how inconvenient. The foundation of the law, he'd often lectured to young lawyers, was not convenience, but truth. For the first time all day, he felt a sliver of doubt. Not about Jamal's guilt, necessarily, but about the absolute certainty of the prosecution's case. He made a decision. It was a small one, a minor procedural turn, but it felt momentous. It was a turn away from the easy path. Bailiff, Judge Thompson said, his voice devoid of its earlier mockery. It was now the voice of pure, cold authority. Get a team from Public Works. I want them at the corner of 4th and Elm. I want them to open that storm drain now. He looked at Henderson, then at Jamal. And the jury will remain sequestered until they get back. The courtroom was stunned into silence. Henderson's face was a mask of disbelief. Jamal felt a surge of adrenaline, a fragile, terrifying hope. He had been drowning, his hands slipping from the edge. And now, a judge who had mocked him, who had dismissed him at every turn, had just thrown him a lifeline. The turning point hadn't been a dramatic speech or a last-minute witness. It was a blurry photograph and a tiny, metallic glint. It was a seed of doubt, planted in the most hardened soil, beginning, impossibly, to grow. The weight was agonizing. An hour stretched into 2. The courtroom remained in a state of suspended animation, the air thick with unspoken questions. Jamal sat at the defendant's table, his mind a whirlwind of hope and fear. He didn't dare to hope too much. He had been let down too many times. Across the room, Henderson paced like a caged animal, periodically shooting venomous glares at Jamal. Mr. Davenport looked increasingly uncomfortable. his polished veneer starting to crack as he dabbed at his sweaty brow with a silk handkerchief. Judge Thompson remained at the bench, stonily reviewing other case files, but his focus was gone. He kept glancing at the clock, then at the courtroom doors. He was annoyed at the delay, at the disruption to his orderly schedule. This was a wild goose chase, a waste of city resources, all because he'd indulged a desperate kid's fantasy. He was already composing the tongue-lashing he would deliver to Jamal when the search came up empty. He'd make an example of him for wasting the court's time. Finally, the courtroom doors swung open. A bailiff entered, followed by a man in a mud-stained public works uniform. The man held a small, clear plastic bag. Inside, nestled on a piece of white gauze, was a single diamond earring, caked in grime but unmistakably real. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Henderson froze mid-pace, his mouth hanging open. Davenport's face went from pale to a ghastly shade of white. Jamal felt the air leave his lungs in a rush, a dizzying wave of relief washing over him that made the room swim. The public works employee explained that they had found it in the sediment trap of the storm drain, exactly where Jamal's photograph had indicated. It had clearly been there for some time, washed down by the recent rains. Judge Thompson stared at the earring. The simple, physical proof. It was impossible. It completely contradicted the narrative he had accepted without question. The boy hadn't stolen it. He had, in fact, been telling the truth all along. The judge felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. He had been wrong. Not just wrong about a fact, but profoundly, fundamentally wrong about a person. He looked at Jamal, truly looked at him for the first time. He didn't see a thug or a statistic. He saw a terrified, resilient kid who had fought for his honor with nothing but his own words and a blurry photograph. In light of this new evidence, Judge Thompson said, his voice gravelly, the court finds that the prosecution's case is irreparably compromised. All charges against Mr. Hayes are dismissed. You are free to go. But the story wasn't over. The twist, the one that would shatter everything, was yet to come. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs and Jamal's pro bono legal aid, a young woman who had been sitting in the back, rushed to his side. The bailiff approached the bench again. He handed the judge the evidence bag containing the earring, along with another, smaller bag. We found this too, Your Honor, the bailiff said quietly. It was in the same trap. It's a locket. The judge took the bag. The locket was small and silver, tarnished with age and grime. It was heart-shaped. He turned it over in his hand. There was an inscription on the back. The letters were faded, but he could just make them out. He didn't need his glasses to read them. He knew what they said. He had traced them with his own finger 1,000 times in his memory. AT to CT forever. The air turned to ice in his lungs. The courtroom, the people, the sounds, they all faded away, replaced by a roaring in his ears. It was his wife's locket, the one he had given her on their first anniversary. She was wearing it the day she died. He looked up, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror and locked gaze with Mr. Davenport. The real estate mogul was no longer pale. He was ashen. He was already backing away, trying to melt into the crowd, his eyes darting towards the exit. "Stop him," Judge Thompson whispered, his voice a choked, broken thing. "Don't let him leave." The bailiffs, confused but responding to the raw command in the judge's voice, moved to block the doors. The judge's mind was a maelstrom of fractured images. The twisted metal of the car wreck, the flashing lights, the face of the teenager who had killed his family, his eyes wide and scared, the police report, the details he had obsessed over for years, memorizing every line, the inventory of personal effects recovered from the scene, his wife's purse, her wedding ring. But the locket, her most treasured possession, had been missing. It was presumed lost in the chaos of the crash, perhaps stolen by first responders, a theory he had clung to, another injustice to fuel his rage. But the crash hadn't happened on a quiet, residential street. It had happened on the corner of 4th and Elm, the exact same corner where Jamal had found the wallet. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, gut-wrenching certainty. Davenport hadn't just lied about the earring. He had been there that night. The night Judge Thompson's world had ended. The judge stood up, his body trembling, his judicial mask stripped away, leaving only a man raw with 2 decades of unresolved grief and a terrible, new understanding. He pointed a shaking finger at Davenport. "You," he croaked, his voice cracking. "You were there." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation that echoed with years of pain. "My wife. My daughter. You were there." Davenport crumpled, his bravado gone, replaced by the pathetic terror of a man whose carefully constructed life had just been demolished. The shocking twist wasn't about Jamal's innocence or Davenport's petty insurance fraud. It was about a lie that had festered for 20 years, a lie that had poisoned a good man's soul and had nearly sent another innocent boy to prison. The judge had spent 2 decades hating a ghost, channeling his rage at every kid who looked like the one who had destroyed his family, when the real villain, a man who had fled the scene and hidden his involvement, had been standing in his courtroom all along, the architect of a new injustice. The judge hadn't just been wrong about Jamal, he had been wrong about everything. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with the news of Jamal's exoneration, fell into a stunned, tomb-like silence. The air crackled with a new, far more volatile tension. This was no longer a simple case of theft. It was the public unraveling of a man's soul and the exhumation of a long-buried crime. Judge Thompson descended from the bench, his black robes trailing behind him like the wings of a fallen angel. He moved not with judicial authority, but with the slow, deliberate steps of a man walking towards his own ghost. He stopped a few feet from Davenport, who was now being flanked by 2 bailiffs, his face a grotesque mask of sweat and fear. "The locket," Judge Thompson said, his voice dangerously quiet. He held up the small plastic bag, the tarnished silver heart seeming to pulse with a life of its own. "Where did you get it?" Davenport stammered, his eyes wide and darting. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never seen that before in my life." "Liar!" The word ripped from Thompson's throat, a raw, primal scream of anguish that stunned the courtroom. All pretense of judicial decorum was gone. This was not a judge. This was a husband and a father, his grief laid bare for all to see. "That locket was on my wife's neck when she died. It was ripped from her in the crash. The crash you were in." Henderson, the prosecutor, finally found his voice, stepping forward tentatively. "Your Honor, with all due respect, what is happening? This is highly irregular." "Irregular?" Thompson wheeled on him, his eyes blazing. "What's irregular is that this man, this pillar of the community, has been walking free for 20 years while I... He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of those 2 decades, of all the bitterness and misdirected rage, pressed down on him, suffocating him. He turned his attention back to Davenport. His legal mind, honed by 30 years on the bench, began to reassert itself, cutting through the fog of his grief. He started connecting the dots, the details of the old case file swimming to the surface of his memory. "There was a second set of tire tracks at the scene," he said, thinking aloud. "The police report said they belonged to a witness who left before they could be questioned, a witness who saw everything." He stared hard at Davenport. "That was you. You weren't just a witness, were you? You were involved." Davenport began to sob, his body shaking uncontrollably. "I was scared," he whimpered. "I was just a kid myself, only a few years older than him." He gestured weakly towards Jamal. "I'd had a couple of beers. I saw the kid's car swerving. I tried to get out of the way, but he clipped me. I spun out. He hit the other car, your wife's car. It happened so fast." The confession tumbled out of him, a torrent of fear and guilt held back for 2 decades. He hadn't been the primary cause, but he had been a part of the chain reaction. He had seen the horrific aftermath, the mangled cars, the shattered glass. And in the chaos, as he stumbled from his own vehicle, he had seen the wallet on the ground. It had fallen from the other teenager's car, and next to it, gleaming in the strobing emergency lights, was the locket. "I panicked," Davenport cried. "If they found beer on my breath, my life would be over. My father was a powerful man. A scandal would have ruined him. So I grabbed the wallet, I grabbed the locket. I don't even know why. And I ran. I just ran." The courtroom was frozen, watching the confession of a ghost. The earring, the entire case against Jamal, was a desperate fabrication, an attempt to explain away the cash in a wallet he had stolen 20 years ago from the scene of a fatal accident. He had likely seen a news report about the missing earring, a detail from another local theft, and woven it into his story to add a layer of credibility and elicit more sympathy. It was a lie built upon a lie, a fragile structure that had stood for 2 decades before a 17-year-old boy with a camera phone had brought it all crashing down. Jamal watched, his own vindication almost forgotten in the face of the raw, seismic drama unfolding before him. He looked at Judge Thompson, a man who had looked at him with such hatred and saw only a broken man, his face a landscape of unimaginable pain. He saw the years of bitterness, the prejudice that had almost cost him his future, and he understood its source. It wasn't about him. It was never about him. It was about a locket, a lie, and a ghost. Judge Thompson seemed to age 20 years in 20 minutes. The righteous fury drained away, leaving behind a hollow, desolate emptiness. He looked at his hands, the hands that had banged the gavel of judgment on so many young men, seeing them all as facsimiles of the boy who had killed his wife. How many had he been wrong about? How many Jamals had stood before him, their truths unheard, their lives altered by his own blind pain? He sank into the witness chair, his robes pooling around him. He was no longer a judge. He was just Arthur Thompson, a man who had lost his way. "He gets a new trial," Thompson said, his voice a ghost of its former self. He was looking at a bailiff, but he was talking about the boy he had sent to prison 20 years ago, the boy who had taken the fall for everything. "The driver. His name was Kevin Royce. Find him. Reopen the case. There was another person involved. The sentence. It might have been different." He then looked at Jamal, his eyes finally clear, finally seeing the boy for who he was. A wave of shame so profound it was a physical force washed over him. He had mocked this boy. He had tried to break his spirit. He had been minutes away from sending him to prison, perpetuating a cycle of injustice born from his own unhealed wound. "Mr. Hayes," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He couldn't say, "I'm sorry." The words were too small, too hollow to contain the vastness of his regret. Instead, he simply looked at the boy and gave a single, slow, solemn nod. A nod of acknowledgement, a nod of respect, a nod that conceded a truth more profound than any legal fact, that his own judgment had been the most flawed thing in the room. The climax was not the shouting or the confession. It was the silence that followed. The silence of a courtroom that had just witnessed the collapse of one man's world, the redemption of another's, and the terrible, belated birth of a truth that would change them all forever. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Davenport was taken into custody, his blubbering confession giving way to a stony, terrified silence as the reality of his situation set in. He would face charges of perjury, obstruction of justice, and leaving the scene of a fatal accident. His carefully curated life of wealth and respectability was over, dismantled in a matter of minutes. News reporters, who had been lazily covering the minor theft trial, scrambled, their phones lighting up as they relayed the explosive story to their news desks. The courtroom was sealed, but the story was already leaking out, a torrent of rumor and fact that would soon be on every news channel in the city. Jamal was guided out a side door by the young legal aide, a woman named Sarah, who shielded him from the initial barrage of questions. He stepped out into the bright, jarring sunlight, and for the first time in days, he felt its warmth on his skin. He took a deep breath of the city air, no longer stale with the scent of fear and confinement, but fresh with the promise of a future he thought he had lost. His mother was there, having gotten the call from Sarah. She ran to him, her face a mess of tears and relief, and wrapped him in an embrace so fierce it felt like she was trying to fuse him back into her own body, to protect him from a world that had tried to swallow him whole. "I knew it," she whispered into his hair. "I knew you didn't do it. I never doubted you for a second." His ordeal was over, but something inside him had been fundamentally altered. He had walked into that courtroom a boy, scared and alone. He walked out a man, forged in the crucible of a profound injustice. He had looked into the abyss of the system, a system that was supposed to be blind, but saw only the color of his skin and the zip code of his home. And he had not blinked. He had held on to his truth, his father's legacy, and it had, against all odds, saved him. A few days later, a letter arrived at his apartment. The envelope was thick, expensive cream-colored paper, with the official seal of the city courthouse. Inside was a handwritten letter from Arthur Thompson. It wasn't an apology, not in the simple sense of the word. It was something more. It was a confession. Thompson wrote of his grief, of the bitterness that had taken root in his heart and poisoned his judgment. He didn't make excuses. He laid his own failings bare, acknowledging that his treatment of Jamal was inexcusable, a product of a prejudice he had refused to see in himself. He explained that he had officially recused himself from the bench and had requested a full judicial review of his past cases, specifically those involving young minority defendants. He knew it wouldn't undo the damage he might have caused, but it was a start. At the bottom of the letter was a check. It was a personal check, drawn from Thompson's own account, for an amount that made Jamal's breath catch in his throat. It was enough to cover Maya's medical bills for a year, to catch up on their rent, to fix the leaky roof. Tucked into the fold of the check was a business card for the dean of the city's top architecture school. On the back, Thompson had written, "I made a call, he's expecting you. Your father would be proud." Jamal sat with the letter for a long time, the check resting on the table, a symbol of a debt that could never truly be repaid. The money was life-changing, but it was the note on the back of the card that moved him to tears. It was an acknowledgement of his dream, a validation of his character from the man who had so viciously attacked it. The story of Kevin Royce, the driver from the original accident, also found its resolution. He was located in another state, a middle-aged man with a family of his own, living a quiet life. He had served his time, paid his debt to society, and had spent 20 years believing he was the sole cause of the accident that had claimed 2 lives. The news of Davenport's involvement, of a second car that had contributed to the crash, brought him not anger, but a strange, sad peace. A new hearing, with Thompson's old notes and the new evidence, resulted in a posthumous amendment to the record, a small but significant acknowledgement of a more complex truth. For Judge Thompson, the resolution was quieter, more painful. He became a recluse, the scandal forcing him into a self-imposed exile. His career was over, his legacy tarnished. But in the solitude of his large, empty house, surrounded by memories, He began the slow, arduous process of healing. He started volunteering at a community center on the west side, the part of the city he had once viewed as a cancer. He didn't announce who he was. He just showed up, an old man with sad eyes, and helped kids with their homework, mentored them, listened to their stories. He was trying to pay a debt, not with money, but with time and humility. He was trying to find the man he had been before grief had remade him. Jamal did go to the university. He walked onto the sprawling, intimidating campus, not as an outsider, but as someone who had earned his place. He excelled, his designs imbued with a new sense of purpose, a focus on community spaces, on buildings that brought people together rather than separating them. He never forgot the lessons of courtroom 3B. He had learned that justice was not a building or a robe or a gavel. It was a fragile human thing, easily broken and desperately hard to repair. He had learned that a person's truth was the most powerful thing they owned. And he had learned that sometimes the foundation of a new life must be built on the rubble of the old one. In the end, this is not just a story about a courtroom drama. It's a story about the invisible prisons we build for ourselves and for others. Judge Thompson lived in a prison of grief, its bars forged from loss and prejudice. From within that cell, he judged the world, seeing every young man like Jamal not as an individual, but as a ghost of his own pain. He confused justice with vengeance, and in doing so, he nearly became the very thing he despised, a force of blind, destructive injustice. His story is a stark reminder that prejudice is often born from unhealed wounds. It is a poison that seeps into the soul, distorting our vision and allowing us to inflict on others the pain we cannot resolve within ourselves. We see it every day in small judgments and grand injustices. We build walls between us and them, forgetting that on the other side of that wall is a human being with a story as complex and valid as our own. Judge Thompson's journey from the heights of the bench to the humility of a community center, Volunteer shows us that redemption is possible, but it demands a heavy price. The willingness to confront the ugliest parts of ourselves, to tear down the prisons of our own making, and to serve the very people we once condemned. Jamal's story, on the other hand, is a testament to the enduring power of integrity. He walked into a system designed to crush him, armed with nothing but the truth. In a world that constantly pressures us to compromise, to take the easy way out, to plead guilty even when we are innocent, his defiance is a beacon. He teaches us that our character is the one thing no one can take from us. It is the foundation upon which we must build our lives, just as his father taught him. His victory was not just in being exonerated, it was in forcing a broken system and a broken man to look in the mirror. This story asks us to do the same. Look in the mirror. Where are our blind spots? What unhealed wounds are shaping our judgments of others? Are we, in our own lives, acting as judge, jury, and executioner, condemning people based on incomplete evidence and preconceived notions? Or are we, like Jamal, willing to stand for the truth, especially when it is difficult? The world is full of Jamals and Thompsons. It is full of people crying out for justice and people who have forgotten what justice means. The space between them is where the most important work of our lives is done. It is the space where we choose empathy over prejudice, truth over convenience, and connection over condemnation. The ultimate lesson from Courtroom 3B is that the scales of justice are not held by judges alone. They are held in the hands of every one of us, and it is our daily choices, our willingness to see the humanity in others, that will ultimately determine which way they tip.